Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're just going to wait a few minutes to give our attendees a minute to log on. We'll get started in just a moment. Thank you. Thank you for joining, everyone. We're just going to wait one more minute to give our attendees a chance to join. All right. Good afternoon and welcome to today's event presented by the University of Maryland's Program for Public Consultation and Voice of the People, two nonprofit organizations that seek to give the public a greater voice. Today, we will be discussing the findings from a new national survey exploring legislative proposals that could change how we treat people with criminal record histories with respect to employment, public housing, licensing boards, and voting. We'll begin with a presentation of the survey findings, followed by a discussion with our distinguished panelists. We'll open the conversation to questions from the audience later on in the program. To kick us off with a presentation of the survey findings is Dr. Steven Kull. Dr. Kull is a political psychologist and director of the Program for Public Consultation within the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He also founded and serves as president of Voice of the People, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization seeking to give the public a greater voice in government decision-making. Neither organization takes positions on issues. For nearly 3 decades, Dr. Kull has conducted in-depth studies of public opinion on public policy issues in the United States and around the world. He's noted for developing innovative methods for consulting the public on public policy. He has worked extensively with officials in the US Congress, the executive branch, and the United Nations to develop surveys that help policymakers gain greater insight into the public's values and beliefs on policy issues. And I'll turn it over now to Dr. Kull.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. We believe that this topic today is really quite an important topic. As you know, there's quite a lot of discussion these days about the negative impacts for people with criminal records. Many Americans are surprised to hear that 1 in 3 American adults, about 78 million people, have a criminal record. And for people of color, these numbers are substantially higher. Many of these people have been arrested or charged but never convicted. And others have been convicted of minor nonviolent crimes. And that nonetheless, these criminal records, even when they've simply been arrested and never even charged, stay with people their entire life. And these can have negative consequences to people's ability to get employment, to get housing, and to vote. Across the country, there are various government and public institutions, such as public housing authorities, licensing boards, and so on, and that have rules that prohibit people with criminal records from getting jobs, licenses, and public housing. There are tens of thousands of these rules across the country. Also, in terms of private employers, there's substantial discrimination against people with criminal records, and once again, studies have found that this discrimination falls particularly hard on people of color. And finally, that criminal records can impact people's right to vote in some states. So as a result, there are a number of pieces of legislation in Congress that have tried to address or counter these or limit these negative consequences of a criminal record. The Program for Public Consultation, we do a kind of unique survey. Our goal is to bring the public to the table and give them the capability to really create a meaningful input into a public policy issue. Many standard polls people don't really have adequate information and haven't heard the pro and con arguments. So what we do is we take a representative sample and we take them through a process called a policymaking simulation that seeks to put them in the shoes of a policymaker. So they're first given a briefing on a proposal being considered, and they evaluate arguments pro and con, and only then do they give their recommendation. The policymaking simulation is reviewed by experts across the spectrum of attitudes about the issue so that we're sure that the briefings are accurate and balanced, and that the arguments being made are the strongest ones being made by proponents and opponents of the proposition. So let's turn to the bill here, can we go back a slide though? I want to. These are the current pieces of legislation or recent pieces of legislation that we used in developing this survey. There were proposals for addressing the negative consequences of criminal records in all these pieces of legislation. For the survey itself, moving on to the methodology, we used a sample provided by Nielsen Scarborough. It was fielded in February. There were 2,487 registered voters, which gives a margin of error of 2%. And the sample was ultimately weighted by age, income, gender, education, and so on, as well as party affiliation. Now you'll see we also did an analysis where we divided people 6 ways, depending on the Cook PBI rating of their congressional district. So you can see if they live in very red, somewhat red, over to very blue districts. I'm going to be showing you the very red and very blue, the different ends of the spectrum, so you can see how it varies. So the first proposal that we're going to be looking at is a proposal to prohibit employers and licensing boards from rejecting a job or license applicant or terminating an employee on the basis that they had been arrested but not charged, or charged but not convicted. This is in the Next Step Act. We first also, by the way, asked, were you aware that people can have a criminal record when they're arrested but never charged with committing a crime? And only half were aware of this in all the different categories. So we presented the argument in favor. I'm going to give you just these very brief, show you these very brief summaries. In fact, these are 3 or 4 sentences, but I'm just going to give you a kind of quick summary so you can get a feel for it. So the argument in favor basically said an essential principle of our justice system is that people who are not proven to be guilty should not be punished. And overwhelming numbers find this a convincing argument, 85%. The argument against that it's perfectly reasonable to use an arrest record to make judgments about an applicant, that does not do very well. Less than half find that convincing. Larger number of Republicans. And you can see that in red districts, it's a bit more convincing than in blue districts, but still you don't have it more than a majority. It's normal, by the way, to have majorities finding both the pro and the con convincing. It's like people are saying, oh, that's a good point. Well, that's a good point too. You know, so, but you'll see actually throughout, it's unusual how much the argument against just does not do very well. And I want to repeat that we've really worked hard to make sure that these are the strongest arguments being made. So for the final recommendation, we asked whether they favor or oppose this proposal, and 81% favored this proposal that prohibits licensing boards from disqualifying and employers from disqualifying a person because they're arrested but not charged, or charged with a crime but not found guilty. And this is very bipartisan, 72% of Republicans as well as 90% of Democrats. And it's true in very red to very blue congressional districts. We also break out the demographics by a whole range of categories. I won't go through them all because you can see that there's a pretty clear consistent theme that in basically every demographic category, you get an overwhelming majority favoring this proposal. The next one we explored is to prohibit employers and licensing boards from rejecting a job or license applicant or terminating an employee because they have been convicted for a petty nonviolent offense. This is a proposal in the Next Step Act. And the argument in favor, disqualifying someone from a license or job because of a minor crime in their past is just unjust, disproportionate, and illogical. Overwhelming majority finds that convincing, but the counter argument that a person who committed a minor crime still knowingly violated the law and is more likely to lack good judgment and be irresponsible, that does not get very good traction. Only 37% find it convincing, just under half of Republicans. And then in terms of the final recommendation, 79% favored the proposal to make this, to impose this limit on licensing boards and employers, including 2/3 of Republicans and 9 in 10 Democrats, very red to very blue districts. Very little variation among demographic categories. In all categories, overwhelming majorities favored it. Another one is to prohibit, another proposal is to prohibit employers and licensing boards from rejecting a job or license applicant or terminating an employee because of a misdemeanor and when their sentence was completed 1 year ago, or a felony and their sentence was completed 5 years ago, and they have not committed any crimes since. So there's a kind of time limit. And after a year, or in the case of misdemeanors, it disappears, and for a felony, 5 years. And the argument in favor that an essential principle of justice is the punishment should not go on indefinitely. Overwhelming majorities find it convincing. The counter argument, employers should have the right to make their own judgments about an applicant and disqualify them for criminal behavior, even if it took place well in the past. Well, that does a little better. 6 in 10 find it convincing, including 7 in 10 Republicans. So here, not as well as the argument in favor, but it gets some. It does get a majority. Another argument is that when people who have served time limit can't get a job, they are more likely to return to crime. This hurts everybody. Well, 8 in 10 find that convincing. That's a very, very persuasive. On the other side, well, employers face greater liability risks when they hire someone with a criminal history. And that again does 6 in 10 find it convincing, not as much as the pro argument, especially Republicans find that convincing. So in the end, 74% favored this proposal of imposing these time limits, including 64% of Republicans. So they were more ambivalent in terms of the pro and con arguments. And very red, very blue districts, not very different at all. And the demographics, very consistent, large majorities across the board. Now, we looked a little deeper at this employer liability issue. Some employers and chambers of commerce have a concern that if the employee with a criminal record commits a crime while on the job and the employer knew about this, that they had this record, that they could be held liable. And there's a proposal that the employer cannot be held liable. And this got very strong support, 78% overall, 3/4 of Republicans, 82% of Democrats. And then we went back and asked people who were not initially in support the proposal for these time limits, how they would feel if there was this rule. And a small number said that would change their mind. So initially 74% favored it. Another 6% said that they would favor it if there was this limit on employer liability. And Republicans went from 64 to 73%, as you can see. Another proposal is to prohibit employers and licensing boards from rejecting a job or license applicant or terminating an employee on the basis that they were convicted of a crime that is unrelated to their ability to responsibly perform the duties of their job. This is it appears in the Next Step Act. And the argument in favor that disqualifying a person from becoming a hairstylist or a plumber because they were convicted of a minor nonviolent crime is unjust and nonsensical does very well. More than 80% find it convincing. And the argument that deciding what crimes are and are not related to a certain job is an impossible task that even reasonable people could argue about endlessly. Well, that gets less than half find that convincing. Though Republicans, it says 6 and 10. In the end, final recommendation, 76% favored the proposal, and including 2/3 of Republicans and 87% of Democrats. Little difference between very red and very blue districts. And for all the demographics, there was large majorities in favor. It's a little drop off for incomes over 150,000, but still very large majorities. Another deals with public housing. This comes from the Fair Chance at Housing Act to prohibit public housing authorities from rejecting an applicant or evicting a tenant because they have been arrested but not charged, or charged but not convicted, or are convicted of a minor nonviolent crime. And in the event of a felony, they have a more complex process, a review board consisting of members of the housing authority and tenants. So they would decide on a case-by-case basis. And the argument in favor, that denying people housing causes instability and stress, which often leads people into drug abuse and return to crime, creating more costs for society. 8 and 10 find that convincing, bipartisan agreement. And on the other side, the argument against, only half find it convincing. It's best to err on the side of caution, not tell housing authorities how they should do their job to keep their tenants safe. No, but 63% of Republicans did find it convincing. So in the end, 79% favored the proposal that prohibits housing authorities from disqualifying people based on these limited provisions. This was bipartisan and demographic, and found support in every demographic category. The next one deals with sealing records related to arrests, and the proposal would provide people who have been arrested but not charged, or charged but not found guilty, the right to have their records sealed from the public for a minor cost. And legally, they would not need to disclose this arrest or charge to an employer or landlord. This is part of the Next Step Act as well. The argument in favor gets overwhelming majorities finding it convincing. There's no reason for the public to know about this. And the argument against, that it can be very difficult to get a conviction. If the person did not do anything wrong, they can explain this to the potential employer or landlord. That does not do very well, though a slight majority of Republicans found it convincing. So in the end, 77% favored the proposal, including 70% of Republicans, 85% of Democrats, very red and very blue districts, and in every demographic category, overwhelming majorities favored the proposal. Sealing records for nonviolent drug offenses. The proposal from the Next Step Act is to automatically seal the record of a nonviolent drug offense 5 years after the person completes their sentence. And again, they would not have to disclose this arrest or conviction. And overwhelming majorities find convincing the argument that people should not be effectively punished over and over again for the rest of their life. While the con argument that hiring or renting to a person with a history of drug use is risky, even if they haven't been caught using drugs in the last few years. That did not get above 50%, but almost 2/3 of Republicans did find it convincing, and more so in red districts than blue districts. But in the end, 3/4 favored the proposal, including just over 2/3 of Republicans and 84 Democrats, and in very red as well as very blue districts, large majorities. And up and down all the demographic categories, large majorities favored the proposal. Then we followed up by saying, well, do you think that after someone has completed their sentence for a nonviolent drug offense, they should not have to disclose it ever, or they should have to disclose it, but for a period of a certain number of years, or they should have to disclose it forever? And 38% said they should never have to disclose it, and 51% said for a certain period, and then we let them choose the period. Others said forever, and so and you can see the variation by party affiliation. So the numbers, what's most interesting, those who said that it should have to be disclosed forever was just very small in every category. So we treated those who said immediately as say having the number of years being 0, and then we took the others as who gave a number, and the overall median for how long someone should have to disclose their sentence for a nonviolent drug offense for the whole sample, the median response was 3 years. For Republicans, it was 5 years, and for Democrats, it was 0. So it was just over basically half of Democrats said they should never have to disclose it. And there was some variation. In very red districts, it was 5 years. In very blue districts, 2 years. So now on the subject of restoring voting rights, the proposal, which appears in the Democracy Restoration Act, the For the People Act, the Jobs and Justice Act, and the Next Step Act, calls for people who've completed their prison sentence regaining the right to vote in federal elections immediately, including people who have been convicted of a felony. And the argument in favor, people who have served their prison sentence should not be treated like second-class citizens, gets a pretty large, almost 8 in 10, finding it convincing, while the argument against giving former prisoners the ability to vote again as soon as they leave prison is assuming that just because they served their sentence, they are now upstanding citizens. That doesn't do very well, just 37%, but a slight majority of Republicans do find it convincing, and it's substantially higher in very red districts and very blue districts. Another argument, there's plenty of evidence that for the same crime, people with lower incomes and minorities get sent to prison much more readily than other people. 7 and 10% overall find that convincing, but less than half of Republicans. And on the other side, the federal government should not get involved in telling states who they will let vote. Well, overall, half find it convincing, but a large majority of Republicans, 69%. So this is one case where the Republicans clearly came out more on the side of the argument against, though that wasn't true of people in other categories, partisan affiliations. But in red districts, once again, you find a large, the largest number say convincing to the pro argument, but still a clear majority find the argument against convincing. So in the end, overall 69% favored the proposal, but just under half of Republicans, 48%, favored it. You do have a majority, 65% in very red districts, as well as 75% in very blue districts. And actually, Republicans as a group tend to be a little bit stronger in views than in a very red district, or deviate from the standard form. In terms of demographic categories, you have large majorities in every case, but you do have some interesting variations. Blacks are considerably more supportive than whites, women more supportive than men. And you see this decline with growing age. No real variation for income or education, though. So we drilled down a little bit more into the Republicans. Who among the Republicans favor or do not favor it? And we found some really interesting variations. Among non-white Republicans, you get 59% in favor. Among whites, it drops down to 47. Among women Republicans, Republican women, you have 58% in favor, while among men, it's just 40%. In looking at age, the millennials, you get 61% in favor, and then it drops down in middle age and drops even further, 65 plus. In terms of income, you see also an interesting curve. People with income below 30,000, 61% favor it, and then it starts gradually dropping off. So above 150,000, you get just 40% in favor. And then on the education, those with high school or less do support it, and then it drops off. So, asking this question, who are the Republicans who do not support this, and which are more unusual in the population? You see, they're primarily white males, older white males, higher income, greater education. So we also asked the question, and we asked it in each case, but it's not always very relevant, but we say, independent of how they feel about whether they favor it or oppose it, how acceptable would it be for you to have this happen? And we give them a scale of 0 to 10, where 5 is, 0 is completely unacceptable, 5 is just tolerable, and 10 is very acceptable. And so overall, 60% found it acceptable and 14% tolerable. So we looked at Republicans. Well, 38% say it's acceptable, 17% say it's tolerable. So 55% of Republicans say it's at least tolerable, if they can live with it. Even though you don't have a majority favoring it, you do have a majority saying that they could tolerate it. And you see this variation between the very red and very blue districts as well. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up, and want to pass the ball to Dylan Hayre, who will take it from here.
We'd like to welcome Mr. Dylan Hayre. Mr. Hayre helps identify and manage philanthropic opportunities and strategies for the criminal justice team of Arnold Ventures, focusing on supervision and reintegration. He previously served as the senior policy advisor at Just Leadership USA and as a strategist at the ACLU, where he led policy analysis on various issues and helped build, advised on, and managed justice reform campaigns. Mr. Hayre began his career as a prosecutor in his home state of Massachusetts and went on to manage his own criminal defense practice. Mr. Hayre, the mic is yours.
Great, thank you, Emily, and thank you, Steve, for hosting us all today, and for the extraordinary work you've done to bring to light the public's views on these critical issues that impact, as you pointed out, so many people. And thank you all for joining us for today's panel. These findings are very important and timely. As you may know, April is Second Chance Month, so it's an opportune time to think about policies related to second chances for formerly incarcerated people. We have an expert and esteemed panel here today to discuss these survey findings that Steven just briefed us on, and I'd like to introduce them to you. First, we are joined by Dr. Makada Henry-Nickie, currently a Fellow of Governance Studies at Brookings. Her career and research have focused on promoting policies that advance inclusive economic opportunities for disadvantaged families and low-income communities. Prior to joining Brookings, she was a senior analyst with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where she advised on consumer financial protection and fair lending issues. Next, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Nicole Jarrett, the Division Director of Corrections and Reentry at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Nicole previously guided the organization's grantee technical assistance, coordinating support to jurisdictions developing and implementing diversion, treatment, and reentry initiatives. Nicole previously served as the Director of Health Policy Research at the National Medical Association and as the Director of Community Health Policy at the Baltimore City Health Department. And Brent Orrell from the American Enterprise Institute was looking forward to joining us today, but he had an urgent matter that pulled him away. So Makada and Nicole, we will turn to you. And my first question is, thinking back to the results that we just heard from Steven, are these results at all surprising to you? And Makada, we can start with you. Oh, you're on mute, Makada.
You would think that I would have figured it out by now.
It's okay.
Thank you so much for the invitation to join the conversation. And to answer your question, Dylan, I'm not terribly surprised. I think in the aftermath of George Floyd's horrifying murder, the public conversation around criminal justice reform has galvanized political support in an encouraging way on both sides of the aisle. I think, like this survey, there have been an increasing number of polls showing this growing bipartisan support around criminal justice issues for a number of reasons. And I think I'd like to call out here the media's role to play an active role in reshaping the anti-Black discourse in terms of how they sort of frame criminal justice conversations. But like the survey has shown, the devil is in the details. When you dig into the subsurface issues, and really sort of probe those fine-grained attitudes, you'll find that the coalition kind of splits up. And that's a little concerning. I think there was an Associated Press poll last year showing that Democrats, for example, were more likely than Republicans to support demilitarizing police. And then, you've got some other evidence showing that, again, Democrats are more likely to support, 41% more likely to support defunding different kind of police measures, as opposed to just 7% of Republicans and just 19% of independent voters. So there's a lot of noise, and I think we're all pointed in the right direction. So I'll just say, despite these splits at the subsurface issues, I'm really happy and encouraged to see the sort of changing shift in the political wind, the sort of public attitude, so to speak. I think that's fundamental to passing what we need right now, and that's transformative legislation, like, for example, the Justice Policing Act. So it's an incredible and encouraging and reassuring start, but there's a lot more work to be done.
Got it. Nicole, what are your thoughts? Are these surprising to you, or sort of what you expected?
I mean, and thank you for having me. Such a timely conversation, and I agree that I think some of the things that are being reflected is a reflection of what's happening currently, a greater awareness. I will say that you're seeing this tension, and I think what's so brilliant about the survey is that there's thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of collateral consequences. It's very vague. And so what the survey did, it began to disentangle, and then people are then able to weigh what's just kind of vague anger, throw away the key, and I'm gonna have in my mind the worst crime possible. And then you start addressing some of these public safety concerns, and then you start weighing out what's fair and not fair. And so I think, we have a little bit of the Puritan American heritage that's in our DNA, but then also this piece of we need fairness and opportunity and what's just, and not having the crime outweighing, the punishment, being completely unfair as compared to what Steve had raised earlier, is just not proportional. And so I think you see that you reflected there, but it's so great to have these data points. You kind of get this sense of that things are shifting, but to be able to call it out in this way is fantastic.
Okay, did you want to hop back in with another comment?
No, I think, I love the sort of centering fairness here and what how important this, people's perceptions of what's fair, what should be done with, certain crimes. I think that's going to be, hopefully, I think, the start of a groundswell to sort of begin to close the partisan divide on Capitol Hill around these issues, because what's reflected on Capitol Hill is not what's showing up in these polls. And then there's this huge listening divide. So I'm not sure how we get these incredible data points to translate up to the Hill and to be reflected in the kinds of bipartisan progress bills or draft bills that we're seeing coming out of the committees, and both on Senate and the House side.
Well, you read my mind, Makada, because that's actually my next question. And so, Nicole, we'll kick it to you to start on this. Obviously, a point each of you just raised, there's a lot of reforms, policy proposals discussed here, a lot of arguments for, a lot of arguments against, and we saw the numbers. Given all of that, and given the environment that you referenced, What are the prospects of these reforms being passed by Congress or by the states? And given the public support for these reforms, who or what is actually the source of resistance to getting them passed at the congressional or state level?
I think like in many other areas, I think states are leading the way here. We've seen even in the past 6 years, like 34 states, addressing occupational licensing barriers to, open up access to people, opportunities for people, and removing barriers, I should say, for people with criminal records. And other significant movements, even currently right now in the midst of the pandemic, we see several states moving in this direction. And one of the things that states are able to see, sometimes we have these huge partisan conversations happening on the national level, but one of the things that states are able to see is they're hearing the employer voice in a more like concrete, succinct way. And, knowing some of the challenges. I mean, some of these rules are so vague that it's hard for employers to understand what they can and can't do. Limited access to a potential hiring pool. And so I think we're seeing a lot more happening on the state level. Ohio, passed the Fresh Start Act, which is pretty comprehensive and hits on a number of these issues around moving away from mandatory consequences and building in more fairness and more transparency. And so I think should I say hopeful? I think there's some opportunity in terms of who's opposed. I think it gets back to the previous comments and what was lifted up. You hear some of the arguments that people are making, and despite what we know about the data, despite what we know about desistance, there are people who I think really weigh more heavily on the punishment side and no end in sight and all of that. But I do think the conversation on the national level is probably different than what you're seeing within the states.
Makada, what about you? What are your thoughts on what do you think sort of prevents these reforms from moving forward, given that they do have public support? And as Nicole was saying, some states are already leading the way in this fight.
Yes, that they are leading the way, but at the end of the day, leadership matters. Leadership from the Hill, leadership from the White House matters on these issues. It sets the tone for where we are to govern and how we are to sort of construct a just and equitable society. Without leadership, we're just sort of like a floundering heart. Yes, we're making, I think, transformative, meaningful progress at the state level, but there's so much such distance between how much these laws impact federal sentencing, federal efforts to expunge records and what can be done in different states without the federal government providing funded mandates to enact mass expungement, for example. Those efforts are going to be limited. So we need all of our systems to be pointed together in the same direction and certainly coordinated. I don't want to say it is certain people or sort of label people based on their partisan identities. However, it's clear if you look at what just passed yesterday out of HR 40, out of the Justice Committee. Listen, 25 yeas, all Democrats, 17 nays, all Republicans. Same with the Justice Policing Act. It's hard not to draw some parallels and answer your question as to who are the obstructionists here. But I just want to sort of take it back a little and say without corporation, without sort of thinking of the 1 in 3 Americans who have a criminal record and what this means for the ability to be employed, to participate, like I said, in the labor market, to just even transact in the financial market space, we are going to be in for some difficult times ahead. And we really need to start thinking about those collateral consequences as opposed to who are the people that we're punishing when we sort of dig in our heels and punish folks because we think that it's a Black, big, scary man who is laying under the foot or the knee of a police officer. He deserves punishment because that's the person who represents all of the people we're locking up.
So Makada, you just touched on something there that I think we saw a little bit of in the messaging that Steven shared, which is opponents of reform do say that there are public safety justifications for keeping some of these barriers in place. So Steven, I'd actually like to come to you for this. If you could just walk us through again quickly what you observed in the poll in terms of the resonance of that public safety messaging. And then, Nicole and Makita, I'd love to come back to you after that. And just from your experience, what's your response to the public safety concerns that are raised in this work? And does removing barriers to employment really threaten public safety, or could removing these barriers actually enhance public safety? So I'll give you all a second to think about that. But Steven, what did we see in the poll here with respect to public safety messaging and the resonance of it?
Yeah, well, I can imagine that a lot of politicians are trying to send a signal of their concern about safety by taking this position. But when you present that as an argument to the public, it is not a salient argument. It is not a convincing argument, more so for Republicans. But in the end, most of them still do not do support the proposals for preventing criminal records from being used in this way. So it does not seem that these public safety concerns are widespread. And I don't know if those who make the argument are how much they're actually concerned about it, as much as they're sending certain signals about where they are in relation to these values. This is one of the reasons that we go through the pro and con arguments, so that we really bring in, okay, so somebody really makes that argument to you, and how much does that move you? And okay, even after hearing that, now where are you? And the idea that people with criminal records will pose some serious risk is not salient. I would say the one that's the most striking is in regard to public housing. And that did get some traction. That having people in our housing complex with these criminal records poses risks. Somebody who had a drug charge, but it was dropped. Well, who knows? Or it's been some time since their sentence was fulfilled. Well, still they might be using drugs again, so that poses some risk. It just didn't cut it in the end. It's also striking to me how much the concern about that you were mentioning earlier, that that a lot of these issues are really these provisions for limiting the access of people with records are at the state level, and these laws that we're talking about are basically the federal government coming in and overriding those local or state level provisions. And that argument was put forward as well. And that still didn't, while it made more headway with Republicans, it still didn't lead people to go against the proposals, including Republicans in most cases.
So Makita, I actually come back to you on this question. And I think, something Steven just shared that I think you were touching on too, is there are messages, and there's messaging and pro and con arguments in this poll. And then there's the connotations within that messaging, and how those connotations play out in public policy matters. And I know, Steven, you were just touching on that too, in terms of the signals that certain folks may be trying to send with certain arguments for and against. But, so Makita, coming back to this question, are there public safety justifications for these barriers, and or does removing barriers to employment, could that actually be a pathway to improving public safety?
That's interesting. I think it's important to ask what animates people when they answer these polling questions. Like, what are you thinking of? What comes to mind? And those connotations of signals, as Steven says, that's important. That shapes and sort of frames the answers and sort of those aggregate results. So it's easy to kind of frame it when you think of the employer perspective, right? People, Holzer and others who studied the bias and hesitancy of employers to hire people with criminal records. What are they? There are these myths or bias correlations that people with criminal records are more likely to commit violent acts in the workplace, or participate in incidents of thefts, or perhaps just generally just lack moral character. I think to legitimately answer the question, we need to move from polling, just sort of polling popular attitudes, and make the case for robust empirical evidence to sort of validate and sort of test these assumptions, right? There's a big money counterfactual that we need to find out what happens when you hire someone who is qualified, but they have a criminal record. So there was a neat study that was done in 2016 between researchers at Harvard University, and I think it's University of Massachusetts Amherst, and they provide some really interesting answers. They examined the employment experience of about 1.3 million service members with the US military. And that cohort included just about 4,900 members with criminal record waivers. So, this is a highly structured employment experience. They've gone through the checks. They've all clearly passed this moral character test. And what they found was that service members with criminal records had similar attrition rates to those without records. So they weren't more likely to leave or be dismissed. They also weren't more likely to be discharged for workplace misconduct. So that kind of takes the other two myths out the window. But they did note that they justice-involved service members were promoted to higher ranks at faster rates. Not sure what was the driver behind them, but that still was, part of this, I think, monumental study. And but they were 1.5 times more likely to die in active duty than their non-waiver peers. Again, not really sure what's driving that, but it is a troubling statistic. So if we are to believe the study, then it turns out, in my view, right, then we probably need to be more focused on the benefits to exposure to sort of gainful, steady, quality employment. Maybe that's what really reduces the public safety risk, as opposed to asking or supposing whether putting someone with a criminal record in a public housing setting might drive up crime because you think they are of lower moral character. I think, to Nicole's point earlier, I want us to focus on the sort of barriers that systematically exclude people with records from the labor market and or even starting businesses. I mean, that's something we haven't talked about, but occupational licensing kind of gets at these two pieces. For folks that tend to be systematically excluded from the labor market, they try to start businesses, right? Hair salons and barbershops. And that's where you find these discretionary, but still very exclusionary policies like occupational licensing that bans them from being able to access and create, just steady, gainful income, lawful income. So I think those should be the questions that we should be asking, as opposed to saying, here's another way to sort of perpetuate the stereotypes and provide more oxygen for these bias correlations.
So I think one thing Makita is talking about there, Nicole, is this idea of moving forward to like sort of the next steps, right? Like now, in addition to the questions that are being asked here, Makita, you mentioned like time to, there's time now to move on to a new set of questions or kind of introduce some other sort of ways to frame the argument. But I know that one thing we have to do before we step forward even is just look back a little bit. And so Nicole, I'm wondering if you could give us some insight from your expertise. Lots of barriers, lots of policy reforms we're talking about. But when we look at these barriers to employment and opportunity, that the ones that we're talking about are moving now, why were they built in the first place? Where did these barriers come from?
Great question. I mean, one thing that we do know is that some of these laws have been in place for over 100 years. They've been with us. It's been part of our fabric that we have these consequences. I mean, even going back to prior to the Civil War, and even looking at, we saw a surge in trying to restrict voting. And right after the end of the Civil War in the 1860s, 1870s, when we were thinking about voting rights for Black citizens. And so there's definitely at least historically in this country, a racial component to that. And we've seen elements of that even in more of our modern day policy lives, in which we see really fine threading of what counts as a felony conviction versus what doesn't count as a felony conviction, and seeing the consequences play out differently on race. And as Steve pointed out, collateral consequences being felt more for people of color. And that also you put that along with, seeing higher prosecution rates, even for the same, crimes or offenses for Black people in particular, you just see that collateral consequences just having a disproportionate impact. Even with these laws being on the books across all states, when we had our tough on crime moment and we saw this huge spread, mass incarceration, then we saw just how many people were impacted by these collateral consequences, especially when you had so many collateral consequences being mandatory and indefinite, no time limit on at all. And so, so then it's not, so the historical look back, how did it all start, I think is really important because there's still threads of that, but also just the weight of the impact and understanding how we have to climb out of that. And so we have, intersects around criminal justice and social justice, racial justice, economic justice, all those things being intertwined. And we could, do a historical analysis on each thread, history of housing policies, and look at each one of those things. We've gotten ourselves in a fine mess, but it's going to take us a while to get out of it. But I do think that there is this opportunity. I mean, even going back to your earlier question around, really just being able to distinguish what has evidence behind it and what really is a public safety concern. This is the time to call that out and demand, if it's a public safety concern, name it. Where's the evidence? And only tie a consequence if there is a public safety concern. Remove all the moral, turpitude. And we've seen states moving towards that, remove all that vague language and be able to provide more discretionary opportunities. So anyway.
I can jump in here because it is really an interesting question with this level of support. Why doesn't it happen? And there's substantial research showing that for elected officials, they tend to have a bias in their perception toward being tough on crime, toward a kind of overall a somewhat punitive position, and they perceive this as safe. And this is it's been well researched that this is a pervasive tendency. And even when they get polling data to the contrary, they assume, well, but if I'm attacked, if somebody makes the counter argument, that attitude's going to collapse. That people are very vulnerable to any argument, any kind of you ought to be tough on crime kind of argument that invokes concerns about safety or something like that, that as soon as people hear that, all their other concerns, all their other values just fly out the window. And so that's one of the reasons why we think it's really very important when we're doing these kinds of surveys that we don't just say, do you favor or oppose this thing? Because maybe on the surface it sounds kind of good, but to actually hit them with the concerns about safety or whatever the counter argument might be. The image is always I'm in an election, somebody runs an ad against me, an attack ad that says, oh, look how he's soft on crime. So changing this image of the public as being so vulnerable to charges or to arguments that express concerns about softness on crime is a big effort. It's a deeply seated assumption among elected officials.
Yeah, I think it feels sometimes very binary. I think often, right, when you hear these conversations take place at the policymaking level. And Nicole, you were just talking to a little bit about not only how it's not binary, it's actually deeply complex, right? There's lots of interweaving policies at play here. There's lots of interweaving factors that have led to this moment. So actually, Makada, I'd love to come to you with this question, particularly based on your prior experience and your expertise in financial matters and financial protection. Can you talk a little bit about how the consequences of a criminal record actually seep into the many aspects of a person's life and well-being, particularly their economic life and well-being. And from where you sit and from the work you've done, what do you think are the major impacts on families of people with records, particularly, again, from the economic perspective?
I think that's a fantastic question. I think oftentimes when we think about collateral consequences, we think about the sort of straight lines between record and employment barriers. But how the interaction of having a criminal record shades the experience or shades your financial well-being, it's subtle, it's nuanced, but it affects people's reentry journey at every single step. So something, for example, as mundane as opening a bank account. Going back to the terrorist attacks in 9/11, out of that horrible incident came the 2001 Patriot Act, right? Really trying to strengthen our financial institutions, their capacity to catch money launderers and sort of terrorist transactions flowing through our financial system. But those programs resulted in some unintended consequences for people, especially those with criminal records. So for example, each bank is supposed to stand up a robust customer identification program when someone opens a bank account. And what that means is when you and I go to a new bank, we're asked to provide a state issued ID that is not expired and provide evidence of residency. So utility bill, phone bill, or some sort of lease. Now, if you are someone who is just now exiting the criminal justice system, you can imagine how difficult just producing those 2 or 3 pieces of documentation is. And that means you're going to either you have it and you can begin to participate in the financial system, or you're going to be sort of in that shadow space for some time where it's very expensive to transact or conduct any kind of payment related business. So then if you're sort of able to, I think, overcome that first hurdle, which again is no easy feat for some people, then banks want to be able to vet their risk exposure to some clients who they just never had any kind of dealings with before. So think of credit scores. In the banking space, there is these sort of depository or banking behavior credit scores. So banks want to understand if I open an account with you and you potentially overdraw your checking account, what's the likelihood that you're able to cover that overdraft payment? So an overdraft is a line of credit similar to the credit card. So we want to understand your payment risk potential. So it's not out of the possibility to see banks going into consumer reporting agencies like a check systems and just doing a soft pull to assess that risk. But what does this mean for people with criminal records? Your question. Essentially, this practice could result in increasing financial exclusion for these folks. And not just talking, hey, I have a criminal record, but invariably they're going to have lower credit scores. Some banks, not all, will look at that and decide whether they want to transact or conduct business with you. But for people with history of financial crimes, knowingly writing bad checks, for example, or identity theft, the hurdles are even steeper. Even if these crimes occurred in the distant past, they still, that binary, that flag still sits on this, your record. And check fraud is still very much alive. As much as we are swiping plastic or putting our check cards or presenting our mobile pays, a lot of people still use checks to conduct business. In 2019, just about 47% of the $1.3 billion in deposit accounts, that was attributed to check fraud. So you're not going to see banks shy away from their ability to identify risk and mitigate these risks. So you're going to kind of continue to see these practices proliferate. But what if you've got these records interacting with a criminal record and a low score, all of that together? We have very little information as to how these CRA agencies collect, verify, and update the public records that they use to generate their scores. The Federal Credit Reporting Act does provide provisions for consumers to access these reports, but a lot of people are not attuned to the role of these reports or these scores and just kind of generally conducting business. I want to open an account outside of applying for a credit card, for example. And then you've got this other area of money laundering. We don't really pay attention to this little agency within the Department of Treasury called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, where bank regulators and law enforcement agencies can both contribute and also sort of extract information from, this database. And essentially, you're able to sort of figure out how to monitor fraudulent activities, people who come in with questionable amounts of money, or who we think shouldn't be depositing that amount of money given their profile. So you can understand where signals and bias and myths start to interact with the financial system in ways that we don't normally contemplate. But they have serious consequences for people who have, criminal records, especially when I think definitions of what amounts to a suspicious activity is so broad and unfortunately so subjective. So what does this all mean when you sort of take these individual effects and sort of extrapolate them to whole communities? I'm worried about seeing an emergence of sort of banking deserts that will disproportionately impact communities of color, who we know have borne the brunt of war on drugs and mass incarceration as we're letting people back out. So again, there's going to be this hollowing out, I think, of access to mainstream banking for formerly incarcerated persons. On top of that, you've got it is Second Chance Month. You've got Second Chance accounts, but those usually come with expensive maintenance fees. And so if you're not able to find quality employment or have income coming into those accounts to maintain them, again, you're back where you started. And then finally, again, I keep sort of bringing up this question of this issue of the opportunity to start a business. For a lot of people who are facing structural employment barriers, starting a business is, the next best way to continue to provide income and put, food on the table. So I want us to start thinking more about these collateral consequences in broader terms, and think about sort of like far-reaching consequences of these records, how they interact and interplay with other kinds of laws that are a little bit, not as adjacent to the criminal justice space, but certainly have just as damaging consequences for people with criminal records.
Yeah, thank you, Makita. That's obviously, there's a lot at play, and there's a lot of work to do. And I think what you're sort of helping us see, or reminding us of, is that it's not just a simple fix, right? There's many levers at play, and there's a lot of interconnected pieces here. So I'll just encourage our audience, if you have questions, to please use the Q&A feature, throw them in there. We already have a couple. We'll get to those. Before that, though, Nicole and then Makita, I'll come to you quickly with just a final 10-second answer, if you can, for folks watching, for folks who may not be engaged in justice reform work in their day-to-day lives. What's one thing you'd want them to take away from this webinar, from these findings, that they should hold on to and perhaps even share? And so, Nicole, I'll come to you if you can give us a quick sort of lightning round response. What's the one takeaway you'd love people to hear from this conversation?
Hopefully take away from this conversation that there's millions of people under the collateral consequences, and you should find out more and care. And so there's places online. You can Council of State Governments Justice Center. You can find out where your state is at around collateral consequences. You can talk to your employer and see what they're doing. And if they have barriers, it's not just policies, it's also what's happening inside organizations. So care about your neighbors, and that's one way you can do that.
Makita, what about you? What's the sort of big 10-second takeaway that you'd love people to hear from today's presentation?
There's no single magic pill that's going to solve this. We've spent decades and billions of dollars constructing this system to imprison and profit off the lives of Black and brown bodies, right? So passing legislation, shifting public perceptions, those are important steps, but that's just a start. And we can't consider these steps or even this progress to be mission accomplished. We've got whole towns out here who are driving their local economies on Black bodies, the prison enslavement of Black bodies, right? That's just a start. We cannot ever begin to settle into a place of complacency and think, mission accomplished. We've got a lot more work to do.
Awesome. Thank you, Nicole and Makita. Again, if you have questions in the audience, please use the Q&A feature. We'll get to as many as we can. We did get one question, Steven. I'd love to throw your way and get your thoughts on this. Is there any polling or surveys related to the restoration of voting rights for individuals who are still in jail, either pre-trial or in prison? If not, is that something that you're looking into? And I guess I'll add a sort of an ancillary question is, how do you go about constructing something like that? How would you even kind of think about sort of posing those questions to the public at large?
Well, you would. It's really key to explain, how you would do that pragmatically, and then of course present people the pro and con arguments so that they can really deliberate on the issue in advance. Partly because I don't think that is actually. I know that has not actually been done. I don't know that what we have available in standard polling is fully reflective. I have seen some data. It's been more mixed and divided and not highly consistent. So I would say that there's not a clear public voice yet on this question, but it definitely could be done.
Awesome. Thank you, Steven. I guess Nicole and Makada will come back to you, and Steven, please obviously jump in here as well. One thing that we touched on a little bit in this conversation, but we didn't dig into too deeply, is from the employer's perspective. I think, Makada, it was you who brought up the idea that employers need to play a role here. And Nicole, you mentioned as well that you're seeing employers already get engaged at some of the state level policy reform conversations that are taking place. But when we look at sort of the economy today and the future of the economy in this country, what do you think removing these barriers would mean, not just for employees, right, for formerly incarcerated, directly impacted employees, but also for employers? What are employers sort of missing when these barriers are in place the way they are? And Nicole, we can start with you because I know you sort of referenced this earlier.
They're missing highly motivated people. That's one thing that we've seen time and time again when we've opened up the door for people who, for employers who do hire people who have just left incarceration, and they are able to speak to the level of motivation and their performance. And I think we invest so much around employment training and skill training. Not enough. But we have to address the barriers that go along with that and really encourage employers. Don't create laws that are barriers that are so complex that they'd rather just shut the door entirely. Encourage and promote hiring with employers in diverse fields. We have some fields and trades that, yes, it's very common, that they hire people with criminal records, but there's huge opportunities around healthcare, for example. You have there's certain states like where I live in Maryland. Largest employer is a health system. And so we have to be thinking a little bit more broadly about the different systems and trades and speak their language. What people consider risks or liabilities and success stories, that varies across different trades. And I think it's a really important industries, I should say. And I think it's important to get specific and also encourage engaging employers pre-release. Huge opportunity to get people connected. Pre-release as well to employment opportunities, and employers play a role in that.
Makada, what about you? What are your thoughts on? And again, I know you've worked on both sides of this issue, right? You've engaged with employers. You've certainly engaged a lot with potential employees. What do you think employers are missing or maybe not seeing in terms of the impact of these barriers?
I think employers are missing just basic economics 101 here. When you decide to just forego a person because of a label that does not correlate to their underlying skill set, you forego innovative ideas. You forego productivity. You forego an inclusive economy. Listen, on the one hand, employees are people that you pay, but they turn around and they're consumers, right out the door. So if we don't find a way to broaden who we include in this economy, that's going to hold back our potential to grow, and that's going to hold back our potential to revitalize and build resilience for our local economies in the midst of shocks. Let's talk about the pandemic right now. There's a reason why our GDP dropped 34% in the second quarter of 2020. When people aren't participating in aggregate demand, we don't have an economy. And so long term, we want everybody to participate. We want everybody to, be able to spend as much, to save, to finance our, our financial markets. You can't do that without people being in the workforce. So I think it's in the best of all of our interests together, to ensure that people with criminal records are not continuously systematically excluded from participating in the economy on all fronts.
Awesome. Thank you, Makada. I know we're running out of time, so I will just close with one quick question, and we'll go sort of round robin style. And Nicole, we can start with you again. There's obviously, there's a lot of collateral consequences, again, that we've been talking about. And I think we've all touched on now the complexity and the interwoven nature of some of these consequences. But we also touched on briefly that these are sort of connected to a system, the criminal legal system, the criminal justice system, that itself has grown, right? In terms of the number of people it impacts and the length and the breadth of that impact on a daily basis. Could you just talk a little bit about how the rise or the growth of the criminal legal system, at least in terms of the population in this country over the last several decades, is maybe also, fueling or contributing to the rise in collateral consequences, and maybe even on the cyclical side of that, how the rise in collateral consequences or the spreading out of collateral consequences may be contributing to the sort of the growth and size of the criminal legal system.
Yes, I mean, it actually goes back to an earlier question about the public safety concerns. Like, if we remove barriers, does that improve a person's chance to be more successful in reentry? What we know, for example, even if we talk about employment, it's not, it's more income for families, and it impacts communities, and it's more positive relationships and peers and pro-social activities. You're less likely to return, and that's really important. You're also more likely to be able to comply with the requirements of supervision, and that's important. And so that begins to talk to the cyclical nature of things. And some of these collateral consequences, there's this low-hanging fruit in which people are just talking, addressing like low-level offenses and misdemeanors, and but things can escalate when you actually have the cyclical nature and I shouldn't say over, but increased monitoring. And if you're not able to meet these different demands, it increases your likelihood of revocations. And so again, it just spreads the collateral consequences. So it's important to think. I love that question because it's important to think about it holistically.
Makada, any sort of final thoughts from you on, we've seen the growth of these systems, we've seen the spread of collateral consequences. We've talked a lot, obviously, about public support for reform, but is there a cyclical thing happening? Should we be thinking about this as sort of a system that requires many points of intervention?
Certainly many points of intervention. I think our carceral system became a penal economy a very long time ago. And when you have a penal economy, that nature of cyclicality comes into play. You've got bonds, you've got TIFs, you've got jobs relying on this penal economy. And therefore, you can't just think that passing legislation in 10 states or at the federal level out, here and there is going to ever pay the bill. And that's why I think we really need to have a thoughtful, deliberate conversation around how do we dismantle these penal economies. Some economies, like if we don't have these Black and brown bodies coming in, we're not paying bills. And that is not going to be, you know, something that's going to be solved overnight. We have to think about ways to rebuild or replace the penal economy in those communities with something else that's less, you know, deleterious, that's less destructive to Black and brown bodies. I mean, the ones that are shipped from one state to the other to feed those penal economies. So all that to say, we have a lot of thinking to do, and the fixes just can't just keep coming out of the legislative arm. We have to think about the private sector's role here. Employers, yes, but just other, you know, policymakers who have to figure out, how do we design something that is less, just less disgusting. I don't have another word for it. when you think of the, you know, just what's at stake here.
I appreciate that. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I so deeply appreciate, and I'm honored to be in this space with you, Nicole and Makada. Thank you for your thoughts, your expertise, and certainly, Steven, thank you again for creating this survey and for putting it in the field, and not just putting it in the field, but really bringing it back out and sharing it with us and helping us understand it and get into it and figure out what the numbers mean. Certainly, there's a lot to learn here, a lot that can be applied. And Steven, I'll just echo a point that you made earlier in closing. There's some real eye-opening stuff in here about public perceptions of reform and of possible reform. And the fact that the survey is conducted in a way that we're thinking about the best arguments for and against, it really gives, I think, all of the listeners today and folks who, the link was just shared, if you want to check it out, folks who check it out, you'll see this is I think, as fair a perception, as fair an analysis of public perception as is possible to conceive on these very complex and deeply embedded issues. So Steven, thank you for the work and thought that went into this. And thank you all for listening today. Emily, I will kick it back to you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Again, for more information, please visit vop.org/criminal records. That link is in the chat. You'll find the presentation and a package of social shares that you can use to help spread the word about these survey findings. You can also go through the same survey that our respondents did. If you have any questions, you can contact Allison Stetler at astettler@vop.org. Thank you so much and have a great day.